Welcome once again to another edition of Luke Reacts. This time I'm joined with the amazing Philip Dolitsky and Liza Ashley. It's going to be we're going to do a roundup of the election. And we are going to talk about what's going to happen with the lame duck and then our predictions of what do we want to see out of a Trump administration going forward. Before we get there, this week we hit 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is pretty freaking awesome. I'm not going to lie, it made me very happy because it took a long time to get there. But here we are, crossed 10,000. Now we're in the 10K club. I don't know what that is, but it's awesome. And so the next step, I don't know what's the next 50, 100. I don't know, sky's the limit as far as I'm concerned. And if you're not subscribing to the Philos Project YouTube channel, you must, because it's really awesome. And also be sure to comment and let us know what you think, because that also helps the algorithm, helps the AI bots, move this to the top of the cool list, and we need this to be at the cool list. Okay, so here we go. Let me hear from you. I'm going to start with you, Liza, first. Your initial thoughts out of the gate. When you heard Trump was elected to be the president of the United States for the next 4 years, what were your thoughts?
Okay, wow. I mean, a lot of thoughts. For the record, I am not a Trump voter, have never been a Trump voter. I've been watching the polls and it seemed like a toss up. So I was frankly a little bit surprised regarding how quickly the momentum built and how widespread the momentum seemed to be. That said, despite some of my differences with Trump and the GOP on domestic policy and social policy and who knows what else, I am optimistic regarding foreign policy and what this might mean for Israel, for broadening normalization with Morocco, with Saudi Arabia, curtailing Iran, reining in Iran's proxies, better relations between Lebanon and Israel, reform of the universities. I think that there is a lot of potential, despite some of my concerns.
Amazing. And Phil, how about you? What was your immediate reaction?
Yeah, my immediate reaction was I was surprised that I was going to go to bed knowing who the 47th president would be,
Yeah,
and
that too.
I think
Well, not at a reasonable hour though. Come on. I mean,
that's
like,
for sure true. That's for sure true. But nevertheless, I was pleasantly surprised as to the extent I think that this election turned out in favor of Donald Trump, and I think many people really had the choice between recognizing what 8 years ago looked like and what the past 4 years have looked like. And I think people compared the two and decided that another 4 years of Donald Trump is the world that they want to live under. And I think that that too is the world that I would like to live under as well. So I was quite pleased going to bed at whatever god awful time I went to bed last night.
yeah, I'm sure the listeners of this regular podcast will be utterly surprised that not pleasantly surprised, because I kind of predicted. I was a 60-40 that Trump was going to win, and I was right. I thought he would pick up New Hampshire. He didn't do that. That was maybe Virginia, but that was also a long shot. But either way, it's been very interesting. One of the things that was big in the news, has been in leading up into to the election, has been the role that the war in Gaza played or was potentially playing in the election. You had this decision not to allow Josh Shapiro, who's the governor of Pennsylvania, who's Jewish, to be the running mate. Then there's the Arab vote in Michigan. I'm curious if you have a sense of how you think that the war in Gaza played in this election. What did you see? What's interesting to you in the data that you have seen coming out?
For me, it's the shift in the Jewish vote, which no one really knew exactly how that was going to play out. But in this election, the early data points are showing about 40% of the Jewish population in the United States going for Donald Trump, which is the biggest Jewish turnout for a Republican candidate since the 1980s, since Ronald Reagan. So that is a really significant shift that is likely related to Israel, to foreign policy, to anti Semitism on campuses, to the seeming reluctance to combat it or enforce civil rights law on these college campuses. But the flip side of that is that I think we are likely to see, and I know, Luke, you've talked about this, and I agree, we're likely to see some backlash if some of these radical pro Hamasniks start to get the impression that the thing that stood between them and Kamala Harris's victory was once again the Jews. And if we know one thing about history, it's that the Jews have always been a go to scapegoat for any sort of inconvenient circumstances one might find themselves in. So I think that we will see an upsurge in that, especially in college campuses. I think that we will see some unrest come January, come Inauguration Day. And I think there is likely to be scapegoating of the Jewish community, and then a political alienation of a lot of secular Jews or just not particularly traditional Jews who have historically found their home in the Democratic Party and who don't align with traditional conservative values. They might have a difficult time navigating this new political landscape and figuring out where exactly they want to pitch their tent, so to speak. Philip, you
Right,
might have a
right.
little
Yeah,
bit more to say on
a lot of
that.
people no, but a lot of people were, like, politically that I talked to, Jews in particular, were, like, felt politically homeless. Phil, as a Jewish man, how is how does that resonates with, what you're saying, what you're feeling, what your community is thinking as a result?
Yeah, never before in my life have I seen a more politically active Jewish community. People were talking about the election with a vigor that I had not experienced before, and I think the war in Gaza really because it became the beginning of the floodgates to the rise in anti-Semitism throughout much of the Western world, certainly here in the United States. I think now more than ever, the American Jewish community woke up and said, of course it is God who protects us ultimately, but is there a political party that seems to be hostile towards the Jewish people and one that seems to be friendly to the Jewish people? And I think many people, for the first time, I know certainly I have friends, family members who never had voted for a Republican candidate, who certainly would not have voted for Donald Trump, except for the fact that Israel and anti Semitism became their only issue this year. I met for the first time a lot of single issue voters in the Jewish community, which I hadn't experienced before. And I also think, by the way, just about the war in Israel, I think not only is there the Israel component and the anti Semitism component connected to it, I think many Americans realize that the war in Israel was another microcosm of the failure of American leadership. And the Middle East is a volatile place, and it needs American leadership if it's not to kind of erupt into just utter chaos. And I think plenty of people saw that 8 years ago, a Trump administration was able to really lead in the Middle East, lead together with Israel. And I think some people are just ready for that era of American leadership to begin again.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting to me also is this the Harris administration, I think, or Harris campaign really found themselves in a lose-lose situation with the Jews and the Arabs, right? Because you had this situation in which both are predominantly or have historically been Democratic constituents, and yet those two groups were at odds over Gaza, specifically in the war in Gaza and potentially the war in Hezbollah and the broader, regional stuff going on, which presented just a massive challenge. I mean, thank God I wasn't the one who had to try and do the PR strategy. How do we get both the Jews and the Arabs to like us enough to cast their vote for us? And in the end, there's this I saw this a few minutes ago, that in all three of the heavily Arab and Muslim districts in Michigan, that Trump won them. Trump 47%, Harris 27%, and Stein 21%. Okay, so that's a very interesting statistic. It makes me wonder, like, what's first of all, what's up with the 47% for Trump? That's an interesting variable. The Stein vote, which is kind of ironic, right? Because Stein is historically a Jewish last name, but backed by a very by the it was the protest Arab vote against Kamala, against the Harris campaign. And so it makes me wonder, like, I don't have the tools at my disposal to drill down, but I'm wondering if, obviously, that 21% for Stein was the Gaza protest vote, but the 47% could have been Arab Christians who were not on board with the plan on with how the Muslims treat Christians in the region. It could have been Arabs and Muslims who were more concerned about the economy, immigration. I mean, I'm sure that they're equally as frustrated by those two factors as everybody else. And so, perhaps the Stein vote was a luxury belief vote. Like they people that didn't really have to worry about the immigrants, or the illegal immigration, or the economy. I mean, I'm curious if either of you have kind of speculation on that point.
Yeah, I think your point about perhaps there were other issues that they cared about more. I'm inclined to think that that's really what motivated so many people to vote for Donald Trump. It was the issues of immigration, it was the economy, it was inflation, it was day-to-day living in the United States. And while we here at the Philos Project, we talk about this all the time, that foreign policy always has an impact on domestic policy, there are real pains that people are experiencing in the United States, just the cost of living, the cost of groceries, rent, housing. And I'm inclined to believe that that probably accounts more for the vote in Michigan leaning heavily towards Donald Trump.
Liza, you have speculation?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was interesting watching the data regarding people's top issues going into the election was that for the first time in a really long time, foreign policy was at the front of people's minds, because it's a saying in our line of work that people don't vote on foreign policy. They don't care about foreign policy, even though it does, at the end of the day, affect those kitchen table issues. For the first time in a long time, people were starting to realize that. And especially people who were leaning Republican, it was a top 5 issue for them, even above violent crime, according to some polls that were done in late October, which is really interesting. And I think that contributing factors to that are probably, the Houthis terrorizing the Red Sea, driving up shipping costs, all of the supply chain issues that have come as a result, concerns over the microchips in Taiwan, concerns over natural gas because of Russia. People are starting to realize that a lot of these bread and butter issues are affected by the ramifications of foreign policy and global issues, and that America's interests, for better or worse, don't end at its borders. And this is a argument that I have had heatedly with people who are to the left of me, to the right of me, doesn't matter. I seem to make everyone angry on this. But every time that the United States tries to retreat into its borders, it's called into an escalated conflict that it has to be involved in, because it just seems to be the case, like a immutable law of physics, that somebody has to make the rules on the global order. And we have a multiple choice menu regarding who that is. And those choices right now seem to be China, Russia, Iran, the United States. And of those choices, it's not even a question. We want the United States to make the rules. And some people might think that there's an option that nobody makes the rules. But I think in this election, it became clearer to people that the more we live in a world wherein the rules are dictated by tyrannical regimes, whether that's Russia, Iran, China, the more American interests suffer, even at home, even in the price of goods, even in ability to travel abroad, free flowing of the seas, energy prices. All of these things have ripple effects. And we saw that in the polls, and people, for the first time in a really long time, voting on foreign policy.
Yeah, actually, for me, it's normally, even though I work on the Israel space, I don't typically, if somebody asks me what's my top three issues, like Israel wouldn't be there because Israel was fine. Like Israel, there wasn't like this existential like um orientation towards Israel, and so I mean, this for the first time really in my, I would say in my life, I voted with Israel in my top three motivations. And I don't think I'm alone, obviously. And I think we
Yeah.
see that in the polling as well. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about this season of the lame duck, right? Um, which is
Such a
before
funny
us. I mean,
phrase.
basically, I know it's such a funny phrase. I heard it comes. I read an article actually about it. That it comes from a point in which British bankers were basically underwater. They were um, describing them as waddling around in agony because of the, they're basically bankrupt, and we're all frustrated, and you can imagine these British in their, white coats, not well, sorry, their black long, coattails, kind of scammering about, in dread, right? Like that's, anyways, that's the picture of the lame duck. And it got used eventually in politics, and now it's a real thing. But here, I mean, it started basically today, with the, supposedly later. We're doing this recording on the 6th tonight. Uh, Harris will concede, and we're
She actually did that while we were on this call.
oh,
Supposedly,
okay,
she
there you go.
congratulated Donald Trump. So
There you go.
the news
And
stops
so
for no
here we,
one.
I know, there you go. And so we are in that season. Historically, there have been, this is the moment, this lame duck season, in which, the departing party, the party going out of power, the person going out of power is like they got nothing to lose. They're gonna do what they want to do, either, and so, there's, this is when the, all of the sentences are commuted, people are given, what's that word? They're, released from their, they're not guilty anymore. Pardon's the word I was looking for. When people are pardoned, um, in the transition from Clinton, when Clinton left office, it's also, a point of pettiness, right? So when Clinton left office, the White House staffers took all the W's off the keyboards of all the White House computers, because George W. Bush was coming into office, which is just hilarious and also so petty, right? And like, so you got to think about like, what are the petty things that are going to, befall us over the next 2 months, but more importantly, what are the things that you think, like predictively, what's going to happen on the global stage, United Nations, is it like, is there some kind of, UN recognizes a two-state solution, and it's a Security Council resolution, and the US does not withhold its veto of that. That would be a big deal. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which handles, the Palestinian refugee issue. Israel has basically said they're not welcome any longer in Israel, which means that they are basically finished as an entity, because they rely on Israel to be able to actually function. Uh, and there could be a resolution on that at the UN Security Council that the United Nations withholds its veto. I mean, who knows? Maybe it does both. Um, there could take out some. Is there is does does the U.S. allow the ICC to charge Netanyahu, and so Netanyahu can't any longer fly to certain countries for fear of getting arrested? That's a possibility. I'm here spitballing, but they, like, all of those are actual real possibilities, because one of the things that all in the game of politics, you got to you want to set up your adversary to fail, and so they're going to set them up to fail. We can all claim and want to be in a world that doesn't act like this, but we live in the one that does. And so I'd love to hear from you guys. What are some kind of thoughts that might what might happen in your minds during this lame duck session?
Yeah, it's kind of scary to even think about, I think. There's certainly precedent for shenanigans to go on at the United Nations, right? President Obama in his lame duck session did not veto a National Security Council, a Security Council resolution condemning Israeli building and occupation with ramifications to Jerusalem, which I think was one of the darker days in U.S.-Israel relationships. So there's certainly precedent for that type of shenanigans. I was speaking today to a friend of mine, former White House official, who thinks that the coming days might be fairly dark. Mark Dubowitz at FDD said that perhaps Israel, the United States, might enforce economic sanctions against people in Israel or groups friendly to Israel based off of a very broad executive order issued back in February that said that the United States can go after people who disturb the peace being a very broadly defined term. And that would be an awful way to end out this administration's handling of this war in Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship there. But I also think that there are two other flashpoints. First, of course, is Iran. Iran, I think, remembers quite well what it was like under a Trump administration, when its economy was totally ravaged by sanctions, when oil production was at an all-time low, when anyone who messed with American assets in the region was swiftly killed by American forces. I think they remember that, and they are very nervous about it coming back. So I think we can see, if they're able to, perhaps a very quick run up to nuclear breakout, perhaps to try to get in some type of nuclear capacity before anyone has the ability to stop them. And once they have some type of nuclear capacity, I mean, the game changes entirely, almost irreparably so. So I think that's one thing to look at. And then, of course, this is a little bit outside of our region, but is China. If the Trump administration puts in certain people into office, Elbridge Colby comes to mind, who's a friend, and he shifts American foreign policy to a pivot towards the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese might realize that they only have a few week window to make a move on Taiwan in some capacity. And I think so, given all of these factors, I think that'll show us as voters, what our adversaries think about our politics and about our leadership. But it also means that, Trump might inherit an even more chaotic world than the world we live in now, which is a scary thing to think about. And I think we have to pray that that doesn't happen. But those are just some thoughts about what could occur over the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Liza, you have thoughts?
I am not really one to make predictions about what people will do. I mean, the big question here also is Biden's interests and how those may or may not be different from Harris's interests. I think that perhaps there's a world in which Biden just wants to ride this one out without creating any controversy and go gently into the good night as the only person who ever beat Donald Trump, and he can rest vindicated in being unjustly ousted, and then the predecessor failed, and the grasshopper did not usurp the sensei, and all of that. Frankly, he doesn't seem to
So
be.
optimistic. It's a very optimistic reading of the
Yeah,
times.
okay. My
Yeah,
purpose here
I
is
guess
to
I have a darker view of
counterbalance you, Luke,
yeah,
primarily.
of
So
course,
I'm
right.
fulfilling that. I can hope for the best and prepare for the worst. In any case, there will be the entrenched interests and the people in bureaucratic offices and all of the machinations of government that don't really make the front page and that many of us aren't really privy to, that I think will be entrenched in opposition to the sorts of priorities Donald Trump has historically pursued on the international stage. I also think that there's going to be a realignment regarding NATO. We're already seeing this, perhaps a negotiation of a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. In any case, NATO countries ramping up their militaries. We've already seen this in places like Germany and other NATO and NATO adjacent countries having to ramp up their spending per GDP on their military. So I think we'll see that. And all of that I think is good because it increases the counterbalance against these actors like Iran, Russia, China, the BRICS alliance. So the more weights that we put in the pro-Western category, the more careful these anti-Western actors have to be before they do anything audacious.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, the lame duck session is going to be, I think, a very tumultuous period. I think, there's a really very interesting graph, and we'll put it up on screen right now, of like basically the Iranian GDP under Trump, and it was like very different from what it is, like even now. I mean, basically almost went. I mean, basically below 250 billion, right? And now it's at 410, right? Like think about it's like being cut in half, your economy being cut in half. Like think about the ramifications. And I mean, heck, think about what you in your own life, your economy got cut in half, and the things that you would do to try and prevent that from happening, or at least to kind of slow the potential demise or the outcome of that. I certainly can foresee um, the Iran trying to do something. My hope is as our colleague Farhad says, Iran is homicidal but not suicidal. So hopefully you know the non-suicidal part of the Iranian regime wins out on this. Because it could be very dark for the region. I did a whole episode of Luke Reacts to the possibility of an Iranian state in which, I'm of the mind that almost immediately what you would find is either the Saudis or the Egyptians or some other Sunni power in the region becomes a nuclear power, and then there is the inevitable like saber rattling to the point where are we going to throw these things at each other, like when the US and Russia finally reached some level of parity on nuclear weapons. You had the Bay of Pigs incident, where the Russians were putting nuclear weapons on in Cuba, or we're going to, and that whole situation. When India and Pakistan both got nuclear weapons and nearly came to throw those things at each other. I mentioned on my Luke Reacts podcast in that episode that I was a missionary, and we had teams of missionaries in both Pakistan and India, and we were pulling them out as fast as we could because it was real. Like like I remember it. I remember the feeling of I have 20-year-old, a bunch of 20-year-old Americans in those countries that need to get out very quickly because this is getting like the rhetoric was just intense. And so you imagine, India, Iran, and let's say Saudi Arabia, who have been, a few years ago had doing a proxy war in Yemen, or they start kind of yelling at each other, and that conflict is much older, right? The Sunni Shia one, it's so it's a very, to me, that's the UN veto piece is obviously symbolic and impactful in the kind of international community symbolism of things kind of thing space. But much more dangerous, I think, is Iran getting a nuclear weapon and trying to force that.
Yeah.
uh, forced Iran to.
I don't think it's easy to overemphasize the importance of Iranian GDP. I remember, Luke, I showed you that graph and I was like, does anyone else think that this is a huge deal? Not to mention the $16 billion in unfrozen Iranian assets that the Biden administration gave to the Ayatollahs. And you look at that and you can chart on a graph the growth in Iranian GDP, and then as a direct result of that, their increased spending on these terror proxies in the Near East that are just wreaking havoc endlessly, and then incidents of terrorism globally, incidents of yeah, I mean, Farhad, our beloved colleague, has said repeatedly that if Iran were to disappear off the map today, 90% of global terrorism would disappear therewith. And that's a really bold statement. And I'm not sure if I would trust it if it came out of literally anybody else's mouth. But the pipeline from Iran being broke to Iran being not very able to stick their tentacles into the world and wreak havoc, that's a direct line. And the inverse is also true. And we've seen as Iran has had more free money to spend on terror operations, we've seen what that's done to the entire region, what that's done to the destabilizing of the Abraham Accords, what that's done to stall the peace process between Israel and Saudi Arabia primarily. I mean, a really prominent theory is that the main mission of 10-7 was to do just that, to stop the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And it did that effectively for a while. And we'll see what happens in the future and how much of this can be undone, because as Philip said, it's kind of hard to put the toothpaste back in the bottle, so to speak, when Iran is strapped for cash and all of their terror proxies are crippled as a result and they don't have the global influence. It's a lot easier to keep them contained than it is to bring them back from as much influence as they have, especially when they're this close to a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said reminds me really interesting section of Walter Russell Mead's book, The Ark of a Covenant, talks about like what was why did Britain decide to pull out of Transjordan and basically say like we're done with trying to mediate this whole Israel Palestinian issue. We're basically, they decide to walk away. And the reason that they decided to walk away was there was a snowstorm in February in 1947 in Britain that basically shut down the country to like for a month. Britain was frozen. Like the coal trains couldn't run. Nothing could go on the sloughs, the waterways. Employment went like doubled. Unemployment doubled. It was like went from like 2 million people unemployed to 4 million people unemployed. And Britain was like, we cannot afford to keep those soldiers over in Israel. We're done. We're tapping out, guys. And so in May 48, they do. But it was actually economic. It was like it wasn't there was some big plan. It was like we just can't afford this anymore. So you can imagine an Iran without money and Hezbollah, thinking it's going to take some big swipe at, well, Hezbollah won't exist anyways, but take some big swipe at Israel, and suddenly they don't have any, like they don't have the money to pay the soldiers. They don't have the money to pay the fighters. They don't have the money to pay their arms that are getting sold to the Houthis or given to the Houthis, and then the Houthis are shooting them at ships in the sea. Like like the economics of a power actually matter. And it's perhaps one of the reasons that I would expect Zelensky. You brought this up before, Liza. Zelensky in Ukraine will likely, I think, make a play for some kind of ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, because the incoming administration will be less likely to say, "Hey, here's another $425 billion for whoever," right? Like they're
For
just
better or
not going to do
worse.
that.
That does
For
seem to
better,
be the
no,
case.
seriously, like totally for better for worse. That's exactly right. Like it doesn't. In the end, it's going to come down to like, what are we doing that for? And the case hasn't been enough well made enough, and like it's gonna like so you're gonna like the economics of this are I think are really significant in Iran's role in this, but I also really also worry about that nuclear piece. It's gonna be a big factor. It does drive me crazy that basically for the last 2 years, they're like are the pundits have been saying, Iran is 2 weeks away from getting a bomb. I'm sorry, like well, it's like it's like the world's gonna like Florida is going to be underwater by 2005. I mean by 2010. I mean no, sorry, by 2020 Florida will be completely underwater. It's like, yeah, here we are at 20. It's okay. You keep doing that.
Before we move on from this Iran point and whatever tangent that was, coming back to the economics and the ramifications, it's not just the upper level and whether or not they have the money to literally pay for the soldiers and for the weapons and for the proxies. It's about the economic conditions within Iran and what that does to exasperate an already faltering regime and already angry public, frankly. And we saw this especially after the Mahsa Amini protests and what's happened in the years since. Support for the regime is at an all-time low since people have been able to keep records. And you have to take all of these polls with somewhat of a grain of salt because it's it's definitionally difficult to take any sort of data from an autocratic regime. But the data that we do have is promising and saying that up to 80% of Iranians, and again, this is under incredibly hostile conditions where people are not going to be very eager to give their honest opinions to the people who are asking them their questions, up to 80% of Iranians are not in favor of the IRGC and are in favor of a more democratic government. And we've seen, and this is anecdotal, this is qualitative, but even these protests that young women have been making of stripping down to their underwear on college campuses, or the epidemic of suicides of young women who have been harassed for the hijab, all of this, they don't have the social fabric even necessary to weather a prolonged conflict, especially if they're broke. And then there's increased austerity and measures at home. I think that that is going to only increase lack of support for the regime and increase the raw materials that would be necessary for an organic uprising against the IRGC. And I don't think that is entirely outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah, no, that's my yeah. That's it's one can really hope that a economically poor Iran would would be transformed like that. That's my one of my like my Iranian dissident hero of the week is that woman who was like scolded for not wearing her hijab, and then she's like, "Well, fine," and she takes off. It's like
Mhm.
yeah,
She's yet to be
it's
heard
the
from, though. I mean, she
I
was really
yeah,
brutally arrested.
it's I have no doubt, and that's so frustrating. All right, the last piece, and we don't have a ton of time, so we just kind of go kind of if you give some kind of high level predictions. So I have this like I have a wish list, and I'll read off Luke's wish list for the Near East, and I'd love to get you like which one of those kind of like hits you the best. All right, so my number one wish of all wishes for the Near East is for Israel to make peace with Lebanon. I love the people of Lebanon. I love the people of Israel, and I would love to see a future in which there's a peace between the two countries in the way that there's a peace deal between Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt, and perhaps it wouldn't just be at that the surface of the leaders, but it would be down to the street level. It would be amazing, and so I'd love to see that be a reality. Um, Israel and uh, Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. That could be just a huge, huge win. Like Saudi Arabia being really the keepers of Sunni Islam. The Kabbalah's there, and it's Mecca, Medina. It's like a really it could be a transformative factor. The third thing is return of the hostages. There are four American hostages still believed to be alive. Getting the hostages back. Philip and I have a op-ed coming out in the Wall Street Journal, and we're very excited about it. About the fact that we believe with the framing, the terminology that we use in relation to the hostages should be let them go rather than bring them home. We believe it bring them home puts the onus on Israel and the IDF, etc. And we believe let them go puts the pressure where it belongs on the people holding the hostages. So that's our hope. Let them go. Let the hostages be free. Would love to see some stuff done on anti-Semitism domestically. One of the recommendations that I appreciate the most is to have a domestic special envoy or a domestic anti-Semitism czar, if you will, or some position that addresses domestic anti-Semitism, because a lot of the anti-Semitism, the special envoy on anti-Semitism is a position connected to the State Department, and so it tends to have an international viewpoint, whereas somebody who is, an anti-Semitism czar in the administration, they would then coordinate DOJ and the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and Treasury. It would be a domestic to address really the domestic fight. So I'd love to see that position be appointed. I think that would be really important. And then finally, my fifth is also domestic, but we're seeing on the campus less than we did, obviously in the spring and fall of last year. These students and faculty of universities around the United States who are advocating on behalf or openly supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. They are on student visas. They are on, workers visas. There needs to be some of them need to get sent home as if nothing less than a chilling effect, to say the United States isn't going to tolerate advocates for terrorists. So entities which the U.S. designates as terrorists, we're not going to tolerate advocating for that in college campuses in the United States. And so my hope is that the administration will use its power of the visa power to do that. So your thoughts on those five or any others that come to mind for you?
Sure. I'll jump in. I think your first point was Lebanon, and I think now is the most right time for a renewed Lebanon. Putting aside, peace with Israel, I think Lebanon has, for the first time in a long time, the ability to really chart its future, to have it be the Paris of the Middle East. And I'm hopeful for the people of Lebanon. We have a wonderful colleague, Habib, who lives in Lebanon, and Liza works very closely with him, but he seems to be on a high recently, that for the first time, he gets to have his country back, free from the reign of Hezbollah. And I think the Israelis are very eager to make sure that is cemented as a new Middle East moving forward. So I'm very confident about that and hopeful for that. We should all pray that it succeeds. I'll touch on the point about the domestic side of things. We mentioned this lame duck period, and I think the most interesting thing to see about this lame duck period is what are the campuses going to look like leading up to January 20th. I think on the one hand, especially in the aftermath of this damning report from the House that came out last week that showed that many administrations, they didn't merely turn a blind eye, but that they actually looked into the heart of anti-Semitism on campuses and allowed it to fester. I think you'll probably see this dynamic. I think you'll see these groups that have caused havoc kind of try to end their tenure, if you will, with force, and to really show people that they think they're boss and that Jews have no place here and whatever. And you'll see a fierce stomping out of these protests by the universities because they're afraid of what happens if the Trump administration follows through on that report when a new administration comes in. So I think that those two issues in particular, I'm curious to see how they get taken care of, though I think the Trump administration has made it clear that they are going to take care of these issues. And I think that we will see, as best as we can, a university culture that is somewhat more free of anti-Semitism than the past 4 years. And then, of course, in terms of the war in Israel, it's been a brutal war. It's been over a year. We all have friends who are there fighting, and I think the next few weeks in this war are going to be very scary. Ultimately, who knows how Hamas might react to this new administration? Maybe they'll try to have one last hurrah on their way out. I'm not sure, but I think, believe that a Trump administration with his foreign policy Middle East team will make sure that a group like Hamas no longer threatens Israel's security and, frankly, regional security. So I join you, Luke, in all those prayers for our wishes into the new administration.
Liza?
Yeah, I mean, hoorah to most of that. I would say at the top of my list is an end to this war and a decisive defeat of Hamas. And then I don't know what the next day looks like, but there is going to have to be an entrenched and prolonged denazification process, really. I mean, you look at the fact that Hamas has had entire control over the Gaza Strip, all ministries, civil, social, educational, everything since at least 2006, which is also the duration of a child's education. So you have these young adults who have been inculcated entirely in hatred of Israel, hatred of the Jewish people, this radical jihad ideology. And that is not something that is going to evaporate at the end of the war. So I think any sort of delusional thinking about what a day after program would look like that doesn't involve what, I mean, a lot of people would call occupation. You forget about how long the West occupied Germany after that whole war, and the ideological rot that has taken place inside Gaza under Hamas is as bad or worse than that. And I say worse simply because they've had a longer reign and they've been able to do it for longer. It would be like if the Nazis had complete control over everything, the entire educational process. They were entirely uninterrupted from dissenting voices for so many years. That is not something that is going to shift overnight, and any sort of delusion that the threat goes away simply because Hamas has gone away without a strategic plan about how exactly to rebuild, how exactly to recreate a culture within Gaza that can coexist alongside Israel. That those are really big questions that I'm glad I don't have to answer in the scope of my work, but that would be up there for me. Number one, end to this horrible war, and peace in Lebanon. Exactly as you said. I've talked to dear Habib, my colleague, and he said that it's like the shushing effect has lifted in Lebanon, and things that you were not allowed to say, you're suddenly allowed to say. And there's this lifting, and people are more freely criticizing the regime and criticizing Hezbollah and criticizing the mafia cartel that has run their country for years now. What happened with the banking collapse, what happened with the 2020 explosion, things that people weren't allowed to say, they're now saying. I would push back a little bit regarding the student visas. I think that that is a constitutionally fraught thing in the United States. I mean, obviously, people who are here on student visas don't have all of the same rights and privileges that citizens have, but historically, the courts have upheld that anybody physically in the United States has full First Amendment rights. So, figuring out exactly where to draw that line. Some courts have upheld that, direct incitement to terrorism is sufficient for deportation. Others have said it's material support, which could also include fundraising. So you'd have some of these groups like Students for Justice in Palestine that have been very concretely economically tied to Hamas. I think that would be a lot easier, but I think a more effective route there is probably going to be rewriting the rules for these visas and the expectations and making it very clear that any sort of entanglement with designated terrorist groups from the United States, financially, materially, all of that, and then actually putting your money where your mouth is. I think that will have the same chilling effect without some of the constitutional issues there.
Well, there you go, folks. You've gotten the hot take on the day after the election of Donald Trump, and I think it will be a very interesting lame duck session. It'll be a very interesting 4 years, and there's room for optimism. There's room for pessimism, but at the end of the day, one thing you can rest assured is the Philos Project will be in the midst of it, doing what we can to make sure the optimistic parts of all that win out over the pessimistic parts. That is our goal. It's the goal. We think it's important that American Christians, stand with Israel and the Jewish people, and we do what we can to make sure that happens. It is not just us, but it is people who watch this show and the other shows the Philos Project offers. We are supported by people like you out there who are watching this, and so in the credits there will be an opportunity to give to the Philos Project. We appreciate every penny that comes our way. It's not like looked down upon. And then we also, as I mentioned at the opening, we did cross the line on 10,000 subscribers, and I would love to see us continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So please subscribe, please like the show, please comment. Love to hear from you and what you have, what resonated with you. Those who are watching, of the 5 wish lists that I put out, what are some others that you want to see come out of this administration in the direction of Israel, the Near East, American foreign policy, the issues, the challenges of anti-Semitism, all that. Would love to hear from you. So please drop a comment. We're here for you. So thank you very much, Philip and Liza, for joining me. I've had a lot of fun. Hopefully the listeners have too. And the future is before us. We keep walking towards it. So thank you very much for joining. Appreciate it.